Someone in Trouble. Chapter 13. Don't Get Caught. To Robbie, there was nothing better than a rainy day. Nobody could do any sports in the sports field, play in the playground, or even park themselves in the park, because it was too cold, wet, windy, and muddy to be outside. On a day like this, everyone had to stay indoors where they couldn't move as much. Even better, they had to use inside voices, much quieter than their normal yelling and screaming. He knew that the kids of LazyTown were sitting inside, nice and peaceful, because he was there with them and seeing to it that they stayed that way. Well, really, the Gizmo guy had invited Robbie to join the rest of the kids over at his house, and he hadn't refused. Instead of playing video games like normal, however, Pixel had surprised the whole group by presenting them with some board games to choose from. Of all the board games they could play, there could not be one more perfectly suited to Robbie Rotten than Mousetrap. Building a machine bit by bit, luring the other players in with the bait, setting a trap. It was like the game had been made just for him, and he was about to win. He blew on the dice in his hand, gave them a shake, and threw them down on the table. They bounced and rolled and landed just right. Ziggy and Trixie leaned in the closest to gawk at the numbers. They gasped and groaned while Robbie gleefully moved his player piece, a little green mouse, around the board and got to put the last part of the machine into place. He turned the crank with relish, and there was nothing any of the kids could do but watch the trap go off. It was like poetry in motion. With a snap, the swinging boot kicked over the bucket and sent a steel ball down a zigzagging chute. It slalomed through the next twisting chute until it hit a pole, knocking another steel ball higher up into the little bathtub where it circled the drain before dropping down, landing on a seesaw and flipping the plastic man into the pan, where at last the net was released and with a clatter dropped down on the mice around the cheese wheel. In all, it took about 10, maybe 15 seconds before it was over. They were the greatest 10 to 15 seconds of Robbie's life. Yes! Robbie sprang up off of the crowded couch in Pixel's room and almost knocked Ziggy over the arm of the sofa. "You're all in my trap," he gloated. "I've won!" Yeah, whatever," Trixie said sarcastically, a bit of a sore loser. "You're the biggest, baddest mouse catcher in all of LazyTown. Big deal." "I'm tired of having to watch you all play," Stingy complained. "It's my turn to choose a game now, and I want to be player one." "Nuh-uh," Ziggy said. "Whoever wins the last game gets to choose what we play next. Isn't that right, Stephanie?" When Stephanie didn't chime in right away, Ziggy looked over to his friend. "Stephanie, are you okay?" The other kids gradually stopped talking or arguing to look at the girl. Stephanie didn't look upset at losing the game like Trixie, and she hadn't made any complaints. Actually, she had been quieter than usual for a while. Now she just sat there looking at the finished board game with an odd expression on her face. In the trap there was Trixie's red mouse, Ziggy's yellow mouse, and Stephanie's blue mouse. She seemed to be staring especially hard at the little blue mouse trapped under the net. "Hey, Pinky, are you in there?" Trixie waved her hand in front of Stephanie's face. It was enough to break her concentration, and Stephanie glanced up with a startled look at all of the people watching her. "Huh? Oh, yeah, that's right." She slipped on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I think I'm done playing for now. Stingy can take my place." "All right!" Stingy cheered as Stephanie got up from the couch. The boy was quick to take her vacated seat, and he shoved Mousetrap clear off the table to slap his own game of choice down before anyone could argue with him again. "Who's ready to play Trouble?" "Ugh!" Robbie pulled a face that made it clear he was not. "Don't you get into enough trouble already? Why would you want to make a game out of it?" "In this game you get other people in trouble," Trixie said with a mischievous grin. "Sometimes trouble can be fun." "You did not just say that," Robbie said coldly. He turned on his heel and picked his way out from between the table and the couch. "I'll sit this one out." "It's not real trouble, it's just a game," Pixel said as he slid into the seat Robbie had left behind. "And look, you get to roll the dice by pressing the pop-o-matic. It's fun, see?" He compressed the plastic dome in the center of the board game, and it let out a sharp, crisp pop. The die inside jumped and rattled against the walls of the bubble. Robbie looked even less amused than he had before. "A board game that makes noise. I should have known. It may as well be called Headache." "I think we've got that game too," Pixel offered. Robbie rolled his eyes. "Never mind. I'll be leaving then." "I'll go too," Stephanie said. The other kids looked at Stephanie as though she had sprouted a second head. Even Robbie eyed her with some surprise. It wasn't like Pink Girl to bow out on her friend so suddenly. It only got weirder when she looked back at the villain and asked, "Robbie, could you walk me home?" "I... yes?" Robbie didn't know what else to say. "You're both leaving?" Ziggy whined. "Can't you stay for just one more game?" "It's getting late, and I promised my uncle I'd be home before dark." "It's already pretty dark out there." Stephanie indicated the window. The time couldn't have been that late, Robbie reckoned, but the heavy storm clouds covering the town made it look like evening. Seemed more like the pink pixie was keen on leaving sooner rather than later. "If they're both going, do I get their turns?" Stingy asked. "As if, Stingy!" Trixie cuffed the boy on the arm. "I'll see you guys tomorrow," Stephanie said, and received a distracted chorus of farewells from the other kids, who were already busy setting up their new game. She pulled on her jacket and slipped out the door. Robbie followed more slowly behind her. The rain made a soft, hissing noise as it fell in a steady curtain outside. It was preferable to the increasing clamor going on in Pixel's house, and Robbie enjoyed the relative quiet as soon as he shut the front door behind himself. What a relief! He struggled with his umbrella for a few seconds, trying to get the stubborn thing to open. Stephanie was standing out on the sidewalk and waiting for him. Her raincoat didn't do much good to keep the rain off her head, and the water already had some pink strands plastered against her face. That was a fool kid for you, Robbie thought. With a sigh, he walked over and held the umbrella up so that it would cover both of them, at least most of the way. He could feel the rain pelting through the sleeve of one arm, but otherwise it kept him dry. For a moment they stood like that, looking at each other, Stephanie with perhaps a touch of surprise up at Robbie's thoughtfulness, Robbie with more of an analytical squint down at her. She remembered her manners and put on another limp little smile, even weaker than the last one. "Thank you," she said. They started to walk. Stephanie made sure to keep her eyes down on the sidewalk, avoiding looking at the villain. Robbie kept watching her. It felt awfully crowded under the umbrella, with an awkward silence wedging itself between the two of them. There was nothing natural about Robbie Rotten walking a kid home in the rain, yet here they were. "So," Robbie said, after they'd gone about half a block in this strange silence, "board games too boring for you?" "What?" Stephanie looked up in her confusion until Robbie's words made sense. "Oh, no, they're fine. I guess it's just..." She waved her hands around, trying to put whatever was going through her head into words. "It's not as fun as doing things for real, that's all." Robbie snorted. "I don't think being a mouse would be as fun as you think." He buffed his nails against his vest and blew on them theatrically. Certainly not with the biggest and baddest mouse catcher around. You wouldn't stand a chance." It got a short, if polite, giggle from Stephanie before she fell silent again. The Pink Girl had never been this quiet before. Robbie should have been enjoying the rare occasion of a child that was seen and not heard, but it was obvious she wasn't quiet on the inside. She was thinking so hard that Robbie could almost hear it. "Do you miss setting traps for real?" Stephanie asked. It was Robbie's turn to be startled, and he looked down at her warily. "My traps are not simple games," Robbie said. "Why do you think I set them in the first place?" "To catch Sportacus." Stephanie was ready with the answer. The moment the name tripped off her tongue, they both slowed to a halt. It was the first time in what felt like a long time that anybody had mentioned Sportacus out loud. Stephanie's face went a shade of pink to complement her hair. Robbie stood rigid like a pole, his shoulders tensing up. The kids had learned well enough that bringing up the topic of the sports elf never went over well with Robbie, and here Stephanie had gone and done it just like that. I mean," Stephanie stammered over her words, "that's why you were always wearing disguises and building traps and things, right? To try to trick Sportacus or beat him at something or catch him." She was wringing her hands, not even realizing it. "But he never comes around anymore, and you don't get to do any of those things now. You had fun trying to catch him all the time, didn't you? Maybe you even—" She winced as she suggested it. "Miss him?" "Me," Robbie said. "Miss Sportacus? Him?" Had the child completely lost her mind? "I don't need some blowhard hero to give me a reason to do anything. I can do whatever I want whenever I want." What a ridiculous question. He started to turn it around on her. "Why do you—" but caught himself when he saw her face. Stephanie's eyes were big and round and dewy. The wind must have shifted at some point, as she had a few streaks of rain tracking down her cheeks. There was no hint of even an attempt at a smile anymore. She looked so suddenly fragile, so pathetic, so on the verge of crying. Oh, no. Robbie hated all noises that kids could make. He hated their screaming, their shouting, and their laughing. But the one noise that he couldn't stand above all the others was crying. It made his hair stand on end, his fists clench, and his mouth dry up. An uncomfortable percussion kicked off against his ribs from his heart. "Tell me, Pink Girl," Robbie said with a deliberate uplift to his words, "did that blue typhoon ever show you kids how to play outside in the rain, or was he too busy staying up in his weather balloon?" Stephanie blinked a few times in rapid succession, seeming confused by Robbie's redirection. She shook her head slowly. Robbie shoved the umbrella into her hand and ran ahead down the sidewalk. "Of course not! What's the good of being good all the time if you've never even jumped in a puddle? Like this!" With a leap, Robbie launched himself at the first big puddle he could find and sent up a sizable splash around his ankles. Stephanie stared at the villain, her mouth dropping open. Seeing an even larger collection of standing water in the gutter of the street, Robbie bent his knees, pumped his arms, and hurled himself off the sidewalk. It was deeper than he expected, and he landed with an enormous crash of water that reached well up his shins. He lost his footing in the slippery depth, and before he knew it, one leg shot out from under him, then the other. He fell hard on his rump into the puddle and sent up more waves. The puddle quickly saturated his socks, his shoes, and his pants, while the rain still falling finished the job, soaking through his turtleneck and vest. Robbie wiped at some flyaway hairs plastered against his forehead and wiggled a finger in his ear to try to loose some unwelcome water. That had not gone quite how he'd intended it to. Then he heard Stephanie laughing behind him. Not a polite chuckle, but the real thing this time. The girl had her eyes screwed shut tight, she was laughing so hard. Robbie didn't even mind that she was laughing at him. It had worked. Stephanie ran after the villain and sprang off the sidewalk with a shout. Robbie just had time to shield his face before she splashed down into the puddle that was fast becoming a tidal pool in the street. She hopped up and down, splashing over and over again, laughing and cheering as Robbie got up on his feet and joined her. They hopped and kicked and slipped around until they were both exhausted. When Robbie took his umbrella back, they shared another chuckle. It hardly seemed worth holding it up over their heads when they were both so thoroughly soaked. The rest of the walk to Stephanie's house went much quicker, and they were there in no time, arriving on the front step. Stephanie reached to open the door, but paused. She looked up at Robbie and gave him a beatific smile, one so bright it was like the clouds had parted to let the sun through. It dazzled him. Before he knew what was happening, she had thrown her arms around his middle and squeezed him in a quick, tight hug. "Thanks, Robbie," she mumbled. Releasing him, she yanked open the door and ducked into the house. Her manners had slipped again, not inviting the man in to dry off, but Robbie was too stunned to care about that. He turned and walked back down the path to the sidewalk and continued alone to his lair. All of his clothing was wet and dirty and chafed his skin. His shoes squelched and sucked at his socks with every step. He felt a tickle in his nose like a sneeze was brewing. No small wonder if he got sick from pulling that stunt. But somehow there was still the smallest grin lurking in the corners of his mouth. That Pink girl had almost gotten him with that trap, luring him in with talk of Sportacus, to suggest that anyone, least of all Robbie, should miss him. It didn't matter. Robbie had turned her mind away from the blue elf. He'd kept those tears from coming out of those big brown eyes, and for his efforts she'd even hugged him. Never mind that. The point was, she didn't need Sportacus, and Robbie sure didn't either. No one did.